This is a true story shared in 2012 on a forum dedicated to Bigfoot. It started as a joke. Ethan and Mark, lifelong friends since high school, were sitting around a campfire in Ethan's backyard, sipping beers and swapping stories. Mark had just finished recounting an old urban legend about a trucker who claimed to see Bigfoot in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. "You know, it's always the same," Ethan said, shaking his head. "Someone hears a noise, sees some footprints, and suddenly it's Bigfoot. No real proof." "Maybe there's no proof because people don't look hard enough," Mark shot back with a grin. "We could do better." Ethan laughed. "Yeah, right. Two guys from Minnesota are going to find the creature that's eluded scientists for decades?" But the idea stuck with them. Mark had always been fascinated by cryptids and the supernatural, and Ethan, though skeptical, loved an adventure. Over the next few weeks, their casual banter turned into serious discussions. They researched reported sightings, mapped out potential hotspots, and gathered gear for camping deep in the woods. "We'll head to Mount Rainier," Mark decided one evening, spreading a map across Ethan's kitchen table. "There's been a bunch of sightings up there in the last 20 years. Plenty of dense forest, remote trails, and wildlife to draw something like Bigfoot." "You mean if it even exists?" Ethan said, smirking. "But sure, I'm in. Let's go find your monster." A month later, they were ready. They packed Mark's Jeep with camping gear, food, and a few basic tools for gathering evidence: an old camcorder, a thermal scope Mark had borrowed from his cousin, and a digital audio recorder. It wasn't professional equipment, but it was enough for their purposes. As they drove west toward Washington, their excitement was palpable. Ethan, ever the realist, mostly looked forward to the hike and the chance to disconnect from their daily lives. Mark, on the other hand, buzzed with anticipation, convinced they were on the verge of something extraordinary. "Think about it," Mark said during one stretch of the drive. "If we actually see it, capture proof, it'll change everything. People will have to believe us." Ethan snorted. "People will think we're nuts." "They already do," Mark replied with a grin. They reached the forest at dusk. The air was cool and smelled of pine, and the faint sounds of wildlife echoed in the distance. The trailhead was deserted, just as they'd hoped. With their packs slung over their shoulders, they set off into the trees, the shadows growing longer as night fell. Neither of them spoke much as they walked. The forest had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the crunch of their boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves. The deeper they went, the more the weight of the wilderness pressed down on them, a reminder of how far they were from civilization. By the time they made camp, the sun had fully set. Their small fire cast flickering light across the clearing, but beyond its glow, the darkness seemed impenetrable. Ethan leaned back against his pack, staring up at the stars. "You know," he said after a while, "if nothing else, this place is worth the trip." Mark nodded, but said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the tree line, scanning the shadows as if expecting something to step into view. And then, somewhere in the distance, a low, guttural sound echoed through the forest. The sound was faint at first, a low, guttural rumble, like a mix between a growl and a distant hum. It echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees and making it impossible to pinpoint its source. Both men froze, their conversation forgotten. Ethan glanced at Mark. "What the hell was that?" Mark didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the tree line, his body tense. "I don't know," he finally said, "but it didn't sound like anything I've heard before." They sat in silence, straining to hear the sound again. The fire crackled softly, its warm light doing little to pierce the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. The woods were eerily quiet now. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just the occasional pop of the burning logs. Minutes passed, and the sound didn't return. Ethan let out a nervous laugh. "Probably just an animal, a bear or something." Mark nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "Maybe." As the tension eased, they turned their attention back to the fire. Ethan poked at the embers with a stick, trying to keep his mind occupied, while Mark kept glancing toward the woods, his curiosity outweighing his fear. Eventually, they decided to call it a night. The fire was reduced to glowing embers, and the temperature had dropped sharply. They climbed into their tent, their flashlights casting long shadows against the fabric. Ethan fell asleep quickly, his soft snores blending into the ambient sounds of the forest. Mark, however, lay awake. The strange sound from earlier replayed in his mind, and his imagination began to wander. What if it wasn't just an animal? What if they had already stumbled into Bigfoot's territory without realizing it? Sometime after midnight, a sharp snap echoed through the woods, jolting Mark upright. His heart raced as he strained to listen. Another snap, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. "Ethan," Mark hissed, shaking his friend awake. "What?" Ethan groaned, sitting up groggily. "What's wrong?" "Listen." They both fell silent, ears tuned to the noises outside. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving just beyond their tent. Something, or someone, was circling them. Ethan grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the noise. "Probably a deer," he whispered, though his voice lacked confidence. Mark shook his head. "Deer don't walk like that. It's too heavy." The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, all they could hear was the pounding of their own hearts. Then, the faint sound of breathing, low and guttural, reached their ears, sending chills down their spines. Ethan's grip on the flashlight tightened. "What do we do?" "Nothing," Mark whispered. "Don't make a sound." They sat in tense silence as the breathing grew louder, closer. The fabric of the tent seemed to thin under the weight of their fear, every noise amplified in the stillness of the night. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance until there was nothing but silence once more. Ethan let out a shaky breath. "We're not alone out here." Mark didn't respond. He lay back down, his mind racing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't normal. And they were just getting started. The dawn brought little comfort. Ethan and Mark emerged from their tent, their faces pale and drawn from a sleepless night. The forest was quiet, the morning sun filtering through the dense canopy and casting long shadows across the ground. Ethan rubbed his face, still trying to shake the tension from the night before. "Whatever was out there is gone now, right?" Mark didn't answer. Instead, he crouched near the edge of the clearing, examining the soft dirt. His heart sank when he saw it, an enormous footprint, larger than anything he'd ever seen. It was deep, with toes that splayed out wide and a faint outline of a heel pressed into the earth. "Ethan," Mark called, his voice tight, "you need to see this." Ethan walked over and stopped short, staring down at the print. That can't be real." Mark nodded slowly. "It's real. All right. And it's not a bear. Look at the toes. They're too spread out." Ethan crouched down, running his hand over the edges of the print. It was nearly twice the size of his own boot. "It's huge," he muttered. "What could leave a print like this?" Mark stood up, scanning the tree line. Whatever it is, it was right here, maybe even watching us. The thought made Ethan's stomach turn. He glanced back at their tent, suddenly feeling exposed. "We should pack up and move. I don't like staying in the same place after what happened last night." Mark agreed. They quickly broke down their camp, stuffing their gear into their packs. All the while, Mark kept an eye on the surrounding woods, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. As they walked, they found more tracks. Some were faint, barely impressions in the dirt, while others were fresh, as if the creature had been pacing around the area. The path led deeper into the forest, toward a stretch of trees so thick they seemed to swallow the light. Ethan hesitated. "You really want to follow this thing?" Mark turned to him, his expression serious. "We came out here to find Bigfoot. What if this is our chance?" Ethan sighed, shifting his pack on his shoulders. "Fine. But the second it feels too dangerous, we're out." They pressed on, the air growing cooler and the trees closing in around them. The forest floor was littered with fallen leaves and broken branches, making every step a challenge. The tracks continued, leading them deeper into the wilderness. By midday, they reached a small clearing with a creek running through it. The tracks stopped abruptly at the water's edge. Mark crouched down, studying the area. "Maybe it crossed the creek," he said, his voice low. Ethan looked upstream, where the water disappeared into a dense thicket. "Or maybe it's hiding, watching us." Mark shook his head. "We're not turning back now. Let's eat something and keep going." As they sat by the creek, eating granola bars and sipping water, the forest seemed to come alive around them. The sound of birdsong and rustling leaves filled the air, a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the night before. But as they prepared to move on, a sudden crack echoed through the woods. Both men froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. It came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. Mark grabbed the camcorder from his pack, his hands shaking as he turned it on. "Get ready," he whispered. "This could be it." Ethan didn't reply. He was staring into the trees, his heart pounding as the sound grew closer. Whatever was out there, it wasn't trying to hide anymore. Mark gripped the camcorder tightly, his eyes fixed on the tree line where the sound had come from. Ethan stood beside him, clutching the flashlight from his pack despite the daylight filtering through the canopy. The guttural sound came again, deeper and more resonant, vibrating through the stillness of the forest. It wasn't an animal call they recognized. Too low, too deliberate. It sent a wave of unease rippling through both men. Mark hit the record button on the camcorder, aiming it toward the trees. "If it shows itself, we'll have proof," he whispered, more to himself than to Ethan. But the forest ahead was still, the dense foliage masking whatever was hiding within. A sharp crack followed by a rustling noise broke the silence. Something large was moving, but they couldn't see it. "Should we go closer?" Mark asked, glancing at Ethan. Ethan shook his head, his voice firm. "No, we don't know what we're dealing with. Let's stay put." They waited, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a branch, made their hearts race. Minutes passed like hours, their nerves fraying as the noise grew louder, more erratic. Then a shadow shifted. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement among the trees. Mark zoomed in with the camcorder, trying to focus on the spot. "There," he whispered. "Do you see it?" Ethan squinted. "I don't." He stopped mid-sentence as a figure emerged, partially obscured by the underbrush. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a hulking silhouette that didn't match any known animal. The figure stood still as if watching them, its massive form blending into the shadows. Mark's breath caught. "Oh my God." The camcorder trembled in his hands as he tried to steady the shot. The figure moved slightly, the shifting light revealing hints of dark, matted fur. It was just far enough away to be indistinct, but its sheer size was unmistakable. Ethan grabbed Mark's arm. "We need to go. Now." Mark hesitated, his eyes glued to the figure. "But this is it. This is what we came for." "Mark," Ethan said sharply, his voice trembling. "We're not ready for this." The figure stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate with each step, and the guttural sound returned, louder this time, reverberating through the clearing. Mark lowered the camcorder, his resolve faltering. "Okay, let's go." They turned and hurried back the way they'd come, their footsteps loud against the forest floor. The sound of movement behind them, branches snapping, leaves crunching, spurred them on, adrenaline pumping through their veins. Neither of them spoke as they ran, their focus solely on putting distance between themselves and the creature. It wasn't until they reached the creek again that the noises stopped. The forest fell silent, as if whatever had been following them had disappeared. Ethan doubled over, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. "What was that?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He stared back at the way they'd come, the camcorder still clutched in his hands. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "But we got something on tape." Ethan straightened, his face pale. "Do you really think anyone's going to believe us?" Mark looked down at the camcorder, his thumb hovering over the playback button. "They don't have to believe us," he said. "We'll show them." But deep down, neither of them felt the confidence they tried to project. The image of the hulking figure stayed with them, an unsettling reminder that some things are better left unseen. They didn't stop until they reached a more open area of the forest where sunlight pierced through the treetops, breaking the heavy sense of claustrophobia they'd felt earlier. Ethan slumped against a tree, his breath still ragged from their hurried retreat. Mark sat on a nearby rock, holding the camcorder as if it were a lifeline. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The forest was alive with its usual daytime sounds, chirping birds, rustling leaves, but both men knew what they'd experienced was anything but ordinary. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Play it," he said, nodding toward the camcorder. "Let's see what we got." Mark hesitated, his thumb hovering over the playback button. Part of him didn't want to see the footage, afraid it might confirm, or worse, deny what they'd witnessed. But curiosity won out. He pressed the button, and the tiny screen flickered to life. The video started with a shaky view of the trees, the sounds of the forest punctuated by Mark's whispered commentary. "Do you hear that?" his recorded voice asked, barely audible over the distant guttural noises. Then came the shadow. It was faint at first, blending into the background, but as Mark zoomed in, the figure became more defined. Even on the small screen, the creature's sheer size was apparent. The dark fur, the broad shoulders, the way it moved, slow and deliberate, like it was fully aware of their presence. Ethan leaned closer, his eyes wide. "That's it. That's what we saw." Mark paused the video, the creature frozen on the screen. "It's not as clear as I hoped," he admitted, "but it's enough to prove we weren't imagining things." Ethan shook his head. "You know how people are. They'll say it's a guy in a costume or the footage is doctored." Mark sighed. "Maybe, but we know the truth. And if we can find more evidence, maybe others will believe us too." Ethan frowned. "You want to keep going?" "We didn't come all this way just to turn back now," Mark said. "If we stop, we'll always wonder what we might have found. This is the closest anyone's ever gotten to real proof." Ethan glanced at the forest around them, his unease evident. "I don't know, Mark. That thing, whatever it is, it's big and it's smart. I don't think it wants us here." Mark stood, tucking the camcorder into his bag. "All the more reason to keep going. We stick to the plan. Stay cautious. If it gets too dangerous, we'll back off." Ethan hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Fine. But we stay together, and we don't take unnecessary risks." Mark clapped him on the shoulder. "Deal?" They spent the rest of the afternoon carefully retracing their steps, following the tracks they'd seen earlier. The forest seemed different now, quieter, as if holding its breath. Every rustle of leaves and crack of a branch put them on edge. By evening, they'd set up a new camp in a small clearing near a rocky outcrop. The location offered better visibility, and the rocks gave them a sense of security. As they sat by the fire, eating canned beans and granola bars, the weight of the day's events settled over them. "What do you think it is?" Ethan asked, staring into the flames. "If it's not Bigfoot, I mean." Mark shrugged. "I don't know. But it's not just some animal. It's too aware, too deliberate." Ethan nodded, his expression troubled. "I just hope we're not pushing our luck." Mark didn't respond. He stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, wondering if the creature was out there, watching them. As the night deepened, the familiar sounds of the forest gave way to an eerie stillness. Both men lay in their sleeping bags, unable to sleep, their thoughts racing. And then, just as Mark was starting to drift off, a low, guttural growl echoed through the night. It was closer than before. The growl froze Mark in place. His heart raced as he slowly turned his head toward Ethan, who was already sitting upright in his sleeping bag, his wide eyes reflecting the faint glow of the dying campfire. "Did you hear that?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Mark nodded, slowly reaching for the camcorder beside him. "Stay quiet," he mouthed. The forest around them was eerily silent, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps, deliberate, measured, and unnervingly close. The ground seemed to vibrate with each step, and Mark realized that whatever was out there was massive. He turned the camcorder on, the faint hum of its startup screen feeling far too loud in the tense quiet. Ethan grabbed the flashlight, gripping it tightly, but he didn't turn it on. Both men strained their ears, trying to pinpoint the creature's location. A branch snapped, followed by a deep, guttural exhale that sent shivers down their spines. The sound came from just beyond the edge of the firelight, where the shadows of the forest swallowed everything. Mark raised the camcorder, pointing it toward the noise. The small screen showed nothing but darkness, the camera's night vision struggling to pick up any details. "I think it's circling us," Ethan whispered, barely audible. Mark adjusted his grip on the camcorder, his palms slick with sweat. "Stay calm," he whispered back. "We need to stay calm." The footsteps stopped, replaced by a long, low growl that seemed to reverberate through the clearing. Both men froze, their breath hitching as the sound grew louder, more menacing. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Mark saw movement. A hulking shadow shifted just beyond the reach of the firelight. He swung the camcorder toward it, his hand trembling as he tried to focus. The creature stepped closer, its massive form partially illuminated by the faint glow of the fire. Dark, matted fur covered its body, and its sheer size was staggering, easily over 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, powerful limbs. But it was the eyes that stopped Mark cold. They glinted in the dim light, two glowing orbs that seemed to pierce through him. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still as Mark and the creature locked eyes. Ethan, unable to contain his fear, switched on the flashlight. The sudden beam of light cut through the darkness, landing squarely on the creature. It recoiled, letting out a deafening roar that made the ground tremble. The sound was unlike anything they'd ever heard, primal, raw, and filled with fury. "Run!" Mark shouted, dropping the camcorder into his bag as he scrambled to his feet. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He bolted, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand as he sprinted toward the rocky outcrop. Mark was right behind him, his heart pounding in his chest. Behind them, the creature's footsteps thundered through the clearing. It wasn't chasing them outright, but it was following, its presence a constant reminder that they were intruding on its territory. They reached the outcrop and scrambled up the rocks, their hands slipping on the rough surface in their panic. When they finally reached the top, they turned to look back. The creature stood at the base of the outcrop, its massive form barely visible in the shadows. It stared up at them, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like twin beacons. For a moment, it didn't move, as if deciding whether they were worth the effort. Then, with a low growl, it turned and disappeared into the forest, its massive frame blending seamlessly into the shadows. Mark and Ethan sat in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Did you get it?" Ethan asked finally, his voice shaking. Mark nodded, pulling the camcorder from his bag. "I think so." They didn't dare climb down that night. Instead, they stayed on the outcrop, their backs pressed against the cool stone, their eyes scanning the forest below. Sleep was out of the question. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, they both felt a small sense of relief. But neither of them could shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching, waiting. The sun rose slowly, casting golden beams across the forest. Mark and Ethan descended from the rocky outcrop cautiously, their bodies stiff from a sleepless night. The fear from their close encounter still clung to them like a shadow. Mark powered up the camcorder again, eager yet apprehensive to review the footage. He steadied it on a flat rock, angling the small screen so both he and Ethan could see. The video played back with sharp audio, their panicked breaths, the guttural growls, and the roar that had chilled them to the core. The camera's shaky lens caught glimpses of the creature, the massive silhouette, its glinting eyes, and the brief moment the flashlight illuminated its form. Ethan leaned closer, his face pale. That's it," he stammered. Mark nodded, his hands trembling. "This is real evidence. We actually caught it on tape." But the footage, while undeniable to them, wasn't perfect. The shaky angles and the darkness left room for skeptics to dismiss it as a hoax. "People are going to say it's fake," Ethan said, voicing Mark's unspoken thought. "They'll say it's just shadows or someone in a suit." "Let them," Mark replied. "We know the truth, and this isn't over. We need more. Better footage, clearer evidence." Ethan rubbed his face, exhaustion etched into his features. "Mark, I don't know if I can do this anymore. That thing was too close. What if it's not just warning us? What if next time it attacks?" Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he packed the camcorder away and stood up, staring into the forest. "If we leave now, we'll regret it for the rest of our lives. We're closer to proving this than anyone has ever been. We just need to be smarter about it." Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, but if it comes after us again, I'm out." Mark nodded. "Deal." They spent the morning cautiously exploring the area where they'd camped the night before. The ground was littered with signs of the creature's presence. Massive footprints pressed deep into the soil, snapped branches that bore the weight of something heavy, and a pungent, musky odor that hung in the air. Mark carefully filmed everything, narrating as he documented the tracks and broken branches. "These prints are at least 18 inches long," he said into the camera. "No animal we know of could leave tracks like this." Ethan pointed to a tree where a large claw mark gouged through the bark. "Look at this. Whatever did this had claws like a bear, but it's way too high up." Mark zoomed in, capturing the gouges in detail. "It's like it's marking its territory," he said. As they followed the tracks deeper into the forest, they became more aware of the unnatural quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that set them both on edge. They stopped near a stream where the footprints seemed to disappear into the water. Ethan knelt down, inspecting the area. It must have crossed here, he said, glancing upstream. Mark filmed the stream bed, then looked around. Do you feel that? Ethan frowned. Feel what? Like we're being watched, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's eyes darted to the surrounding trees. I thought we agreed not to say stuff like that. But he felt it too, that prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling that they weren't alone. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest. Both men froze, their eyes snapping to the source of the noise. A tree branch swayed unnaturally, as if something large had brushed past it. Mark raised the camcorder, recording the movement. Did you see that? Ethan nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight. It's here. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark and Ethan stood motionless, straining to hear any sign of the creature. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, came a low, rumbling growl. Ethan's grip tightened on the flashlight. Mark, he whispered, his voice laced with fear. We need to go. Mark hesitated, torn between his drive to capture more evidence and the very real danger they faced. The growl came again, louder this time, and Mark made his decision. Let's move, he said, slinging the camcorder over his shoulder. They retreated quickly but carefully, their eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the creature. Every rustle of leaves and crack of a branch set their nerves on edge. When they finally reached a more open part of the forest, Ethan let out a shaky breath. That's it. No more following tracks. If it wants us gone, I say we listen. Mark nodded reluctantly. We'll regroup, but this isn't over. As they set up camp for the night, neither of them could shake the feeling that the creature was still nearby, watching, waiting. Night fell quickly, the forest around Mark and Ethan shrouded in darkness once more. They had chosen a spot closer to a small clearing, hoping the open space would give them a better vantage point. The fire crackled weakly as they sat in tense silence, listening to the distant sounds of the woods. Mark adjusted the camcorder on a makeshift tripod, its lens pointed toward the forest edge. If it comes back tonight, we'll be ready, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, the glow illuminating the deep lines of worry on his face. Ready for what? To film it? What if it decides it doesn't want to just scare us this time? Mark glanced at his friend. It hasn't attacked us yet. I think it's more curious than aggressive. Maybe it's testing us. Ethan shook his head. Curious or not, that thing is huge, Mark. If it wants to, it could tear through this camp like it's nothing. A loud snap from the woods made both men jump. They turned toward the sound, their eyes straining to see through the flickering shadows beyond the firelight. Mark grabbed the camcorder, peering through the night vision. The green-tinted screen revealed little, a few swaying branches, the faint outline of trees. I don't see anything, he whispered. Maybe it's just an animal, Ethan said, though his tone lacked conviction. The forest fell silent again, the kind of silence that seemed to hum with tension. Mark kept the camcorder trained on the trees, his finger hovering over the zoom button. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and much too large to belong to any ordinary animal. They were slow at first, then quickened, circling the edge of the clearing. Ethan stood, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. It's back, he said, his voice barely audible. Mark followed the sound with the camcorder, his hands trembling. He caught a glimpse of movement, a massive shadow darting between the trees, too fast and too far to make out any details. Stay calm, Mark said, more to himself than Ethan. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the stillness that followed was suffocating. Mark and Ethan exchanged a glance, their faces pale in the firelight. And then, from the darkness, came a sound that sent chills down their spines, a low, guttural growl, followed by a strange, almost human-like grunt. Ethan took a step back, his eyes wide. What the hell was that? Mark didn't answer. His heart pounded as he adjusted the camcorder's zoom, trying to focus on the direction of the noise. For a brief moment, he thought he saw two glowing eyes staring back at him from the shadows. The creature stepped into the edge of the clearing, just far enough for them to make out its massive silhouette. Its fur was dark and matted, blending almost seamlessly with the night. It stood tall, its broad shoulders hunched slightly as it surveyed the camp. Ethan froze, his flashlight aimed but unlit. Don't move, he whispered. Mark kept the camcorder trained on the creature, his breath shallow. This is it, he whispered back. This is what we came for. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if studying them. Its glowing eyes flicked toward the fire, then back to the men. For a moment, it seemed almost curious, its posture less threatening than before. Then, with a sudden, guttural roar, it lunged forward, stopping just short of the firelight. Both men stumbled back, their instincts screaming at them to run. The creature let out another roar, louder this time, before retreating into the shadows. The sound of its footsteps faded quickly, leaving the clearing eerily silent once more. Ethan collapsed onto the ground, his hands shaking. "That's it. I'm done. I can't do this anymore." Mark lowered the camcorder, his heart still racing. "It didn't attack us," he said, his voice unsteady. "Yet," Ethan snapped. "Mark, that thing isn't curious. It's warning us. It doesn't want us here." Mark looked at the camcorder, replaying the footage. The creature's form was clear this time, its eyes and movements unmistakable. But even with the evidence, he knew Ethan was right. "We'll leave tomorrow," Mark said finally, his voice heavy with reluctance. "But I'm not giving up. We'll regroup, come back better prepared." Ethan didn't respond. He simply stared at the fire, his expression a mix of fear and exhaustion. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence, both men too afraid to sleep. Morning arrived like a reluctant visitor, casting long, pale shadows across the clearing. Mark and Ethan sat by the dwindling embers of their fire, their nerves still frayed from the night before. Neither had slept, their eyes darting to every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. Ethan broke the silence. "We need to leave. Today. No more waiting." Mark nodded, though his reluctance was clear. He glanced at the camcorder resting beside him. The footage they'd captured could be the most significant evidence of Bigfoot's existence, but it came at a steep cost, one Ethan was no longer willing to pay. They packed their gear quickly, keeping their movements quiet and deliberate. Every sound seemed amplified in the morning stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As they began their trek back toward the main trail, the weight of their decision hung heavy between them. Mark kept his camcorder in hand, filming their surroundings out of habit. The forest felt different now, less inviting, more oppressive. Ethan broke the silence again, his voice low. "Do you think it's watching us?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He scanned the trees, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. "Maybe," he admitted. "But if it wanted to hurt us, it had plenty of chances." "That's not exactly comforting," Ethan muttered. They walked in tense silence for hours, the forest stretching endlessly before them. Every so often, Mark would stop to inspect a footprint or broken branch, but Ethan urged him to keep moving. By midday, they reached a narrow stream. Ethan knelt to refill his water bottle, his eyes constantly flicking to the tree line. Mark crouched nearby, filming the surrounding area. "Let's take a quick break," Mark said, though he didn't seem relaxed. Ethan nodded, but his unease was evident. He leaned against a tree, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "I'm never going camping again after this," he said with a weak chuckle. Mark gave a half smile. "You'll be telling this story for the rest of your life, though." "Yeah, assuming we make it out," Ethan replied grimly. The faint sound of a branch snapping made them both freeze. They exchanged a glance, their expressions shifting from exhaustion to alarm. Mark raised the camcorder, aiming it toward the source of the noise. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. "Do you see anything?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Mark shook his head. "No. But—" Another snap, this time closer. Mark's hands trembled as he adjusted the zoom, scanning the area. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a dark shape move between the trees, but it disappeared before he could focus on it. "Let's go," Ethan said urgently, already shouldering his pack. Mark hesitated, torn between the desire to capture more evidence and the very real fear creeping up his spine. The low, guttural growl that followed made the decision for him. They moved quickly, their pace just shy of a run. The growl came again, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, as if the creature was following them but keeping its distance. "Mark, it's behind us," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "I know," Mark replied, his breath coming in short gasps. They didn't stop until the trees began to thin, the faint outline of the trailhead visible in the distance. The sounds of pursuit had ceased, but the tension lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on them. When they finally reached the trailhead, Ethan collapsed onto a nearby rock, his face pale and drawn. "We're alive," he muttered, almost in disbelief. Mark sat beside him, the camcorder still clutched in his hand. "For now," he said quietly. Ethan shot him a glare. "Don't even joke about going back." Mark didn't respond. His thoughts were already turning to the footage they'd captured and the story they would tell. But deep down, he knew the truth. The forest wasn't done with them. The drive home was long and quiet. Ethan stared out the window, his fingers nervously tapping the armrest. Mark, seated beside him, periodically glanced at the camcorder resting in his lap. The weight of their experience hung heavily in the air, unspoken but undeniable. When they finally pulled into Ethan's driveway, the late afternoon sun cast warm golden hues across the neighborhood, a stark contrast to the dark, foreboding forest they had left behind. Ethan broke the silence. "What now?" Mark sighed, powering on the camcorder. "First, we look at the footage. Then, we figure out what to do with it." Inside Ethan's modest living room, the two men huddled around the television. Mark connected the camcorder, the screen flickering to life with grainy images of the forest. They watched in silence as the events of the past few days played out on the screen. The dense woods, the footprints, the distant sounds. Then came the moment they had both been dreading, the footage from the previous night. Mark paused the video, rewinding to the brief glimpse of the creature in the clearing. He played it back in slow motion, the screen revealing the massive, shadowy figure with its glowing eyes and hulking form. Ethan leaned forward, his face pale. "That's it. That's what we saw." Mark nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen. "It's real," he said quietly. Ethan sat back, running a hand through his hair. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Mark hesitated, then shook his head. "Probably not. But this is the best evidence we've got." Over the next few hours, they reviewed the footage repeatedly, analyzing every detail. The sound of the growls, the heavy footsteps, the glimpses of the creature, all of it was undeniable to them, but they knew others would be skeptical. As the evening wore on, Ethan finally spoke up. "We need to be careful about this, Mark. If we go public, people will think we're crazy, or worse, they'll come looking for it." Mark frowned. "So, what do we do? Just sit on this?" Ethan nodded. "For now, at least until we figure out how to present it." Mark reluctantly agreed, though a part of him felt an itch to share their story. The next few days were uneventful, but both men remained on edge. Ethan avoided the woods entirely, while Mark spent hours poring over the footage and researching sightings of Bigfoot. He found forums, articles, and accounts from people claiming to have seen the creature, but most were met with ridicule or disbelief. One night, Mark decided to test the waters. He posted a short clip from their footage on an online forum dedicated to cryptids, keeping the location vague. The response was immediate and divided. Some commenters praised the clip as the best evidence they had seen, while others dismissed it as a hoax. Ethan called him the next morning, his tone angry. "What were you thinking, posting that video?" "I kept it anonymous," Mark argued. "But people need to know, Ethan. This thing is out there." Ethan sighed. "Just don't let this consume you, okay? We made it out alive. Let's leave it at that." Mark promised, but deep down, he wasn't sure he could. The experience had changed him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. In the months that followed, the memory of their encounter lingered like a shadow. Mark continued to quietly research, while Ethan tried to move on. They spoke less frequently, their friendship strained by the weight of their shared secret. One evening, as Mark sat alone in his apartment, he received an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "I believe you." Curious, he opened it. The message was brief. "I've seen it too. Be careful. You're not the only one looking." Mark's heart raced as he reread the message. He glanced at the camcorder on his desk, its battery light blinking faintly. The forest wasn't done with him after all. The end of part 1.